By day, the Victorians preached purity. By night, they built an underground industry of desire, including same-sex desire. Behind lace curtains, coded ads, private clubs, and photographers who knew what to hide. Police ran stings. Courts invented new charges like gross indecency. Men used flower names and hotel registers. Women met in quiet rooms and passed as companions. Doctors called it illness. Moralists called it sin, and yet poetry circles theater dressing rooms and boarding houses kept the spark alive. The harder society pressed, the more obsession grew straight and gay alike, feeding a market of secrets, hush money, and double lives. Public purity on the surface, forbidden heat underneath. We're not dumping every detail tonight. We're tracing the signals, laws, raids, diaries, and trials to see how repression turned sex, including queer love, into the era's darkest fixation. Tell me the exact time you're watching Morning Tea or Midnight Lamp. If this pulled you in tap like so, the next chapter reaches a little farther. It starts with a paradox, an empire that conquered half the world, but couldn't say the word leg in polite company. You stand in a parlor somewhere in London. The year is 1855. Lace curtains, portraits of stern ancestors, a fireplace that crackles softly, like it's afraid of being overheard. On the mantel there's a porcelain figurine of an angel, pure, expressionless, staring into eternity. A woman nearby adjusts her shawl because showing her shoulders might invite moral collapse. And yet, if you lean in close enough beneath the lavender and lamp oil, you'll smell something else, the quiet hum of curiosity, of hunger. The Victorians didn't banish desire. They domesticated it, dressed it in respectability, and then pretended it didn't exist. Everything here is choreographed. You greet people with the right number of words, shake hands for exactly 2 seconds, sit at precisely the proper angle. Too much laughter suggests looseness, too much silence hints at deviance. Even the furniture is under suspicion. There are stories of hosts draping table legs with fabric so as not to arouse impure thoughts. Imagine living in a world where furniture has to be chaperoned. You might laugh, but it was deadly serious. Propriety was the currency of survival. This is a society where Queen Victoria reigns not only by crown, but by conscience. Her name becomes shorthand for morality, Victorian virtue, Victorian decency, as though decorum itself were an empire. Newspapers write about the danger of immodest literature, churches warn of the perils of bodily pleasure, and yet London's population doubles in a generation. Somebody clearly isn't following the sermon notes. Everywhere you look, there's tension between what's preached and what's practiced. Respectable men fill pews by day and wander the alleys of Whitechapel by night. Women are told purity is their greatest virtue, but are blamed for being too tempting. Doctors write pamphlets insisting that the moral citizen must conserve his vital energies, while quack inventors sell devices promising relief for ungoverned urges. The contradiction isn't hidden. It's woven into the very fabric of the age. The Victorians turned denial into art. Even language bends under the weight of propriety. Words like breast are replaced with bosom, and pregnant becomes in a delicate condition. If you're a novelist, you write around the body, never through it. The body becomes a ghost in the story, present implied, but never named. Charles Dickens fills pages with virtue fog and family reunions, but never tells you how any of those families got started. And yet, this very silence becomes its own fascination. The more you suppress something, the more it slips into the cracks. By trying to erase desire, the Victorians made it magnetic. The forbidden stopped being scandalous and started becoming sacred, an unspoken religion of repression. Even their art gives it away. Beneath every marble statue of a saint, you find the same precision in the curve of flesh that once celebrated the pagan gods. You might wonder how ordinary people manage this daily theater of denial. The truth is, they didn't, not really. Behind closed doors, diaries confessed what mouths could not. Lovers met in coded language in the guise of charity visits or intellectual companionship. Servants, ever invisible, became witnesses to the real Victorian intimacy, the kind whispered in the dark, forgotten by morning. There's even a booming market for secret literature medical guides, anatomical manuals and marriage handbooks that everyone pretends are scientific, but are read with very specific curiosity. And here's the quiet joke of it all. The stricter the rules, the greater the imagination. When you can't speak openly, the mind compensates with poetry, euphemism, and fantasy. A society that outlawed open desire ended up inventing sublime longing, romantic ache elevated to art form. Even love letters became puzzles of metaphor. I think of your voice as a hymn, meant something far more daring than it sounded. You can sense the pressure building beneath the etiquette the way a porcelain teacup trembles when filled too full. The Victorians thought they could cage desire inside ritual lace and scripture. But the human heart is a poor listener. For every sermon against temptation, a new shadow formed, private, hungry, impossible to fully contain. Now the parlor grows quieter. The clock ticks. Outside, a carriage rattles down the cobblestone street, and someone draws the curtains a little tighter, as if the night itself were indecent. The conversation resumes genteel, harmless, but behind every smile flickers the same thought they'd never dare voice. What if sin isn't out there at all? What if it's already inside? If you'd been born into this world of whispering parlors and suffocating manners, your education in morality would begin early, long before you understood what you were being taught. Victorian childhood was a long rehearsal for adulthood, a time to master not curiosity, but control. Even the nursery wasn't safe from moral training. You'd find illustrated books preaching modesty, obedience, and self-restraint, complete with rhymes, warning children not to touch or wonder. In the age of steam engines and empire, the human body was the one machine nobody was supposed to explore. By the time you reached adolescence, you'd already absorbed the unspoken rule: purity was survival. The culture turned modesty into a national sport. Curtains had to be thick enough to prevent silhouettes. Dresses required enough layers to survive an Arctic expedition. If a lady accidentally revealed an ankle on a windy day, she might as well have set London gossip ablaze. Etiquette books sold faster than novels, and most read like rule books for a competition nobody could win. You'd sit through sermons warning that temptation begins in the eye, and wonder how anyone could possibly avoid seeing. The moralists of the day, preachers, doctors, headmasters, spoke with absolute confidence about danger lurking everywhere. Idle thoughts, they said, could invite decay of both soul and body. Even dreams were suspect. There were pamphlets warning young men that wasting vital energy could lead to madness, blindness, or premature death. The body wasn't a home anymore. It was a threat waiting to betray you. It's easy to laugh now, but imagine the constant self-surveillance that required. Every impulse had to be watched, every gesture calculated. Victorians didn't just repress, they documented their repression. Diaries filled with self-examination read like police reports on one's own desires. A thought, a glance, a quickened heartbeat. Everything had to be cataloged, measured against an invisible moral standard. Society took this obsession and industrialized it. From boarding schools to boarding houses, modesty became mass-produced. Girls were drilled to lower their eyes, men trained to pretend not to look. And if you think the rules were arbitrary, they were also gendered. A man's indiscretion might be dismissed as weakness, but a woman's reputation could collapse with one rumor. Virtue wasn't private, it was social currency, and gossip was the stock market. Even science joined the choir. Victorian physicians published entire manuals on moral hygiene. One doctor, William Acton, famously declared that the majority of women are not much troubled by sexual feelings of any kind. That one sentence turned into gospel truth for decades. It gave men moral permission to ignore female pleasure entirely, and gave women the reassurance that their confusion meant they were respectable. The result, a population simultaneously terrified of and uninformed about their own anatomy. But the irony of moral panic is that it breeds fascination. The more Victorians feared desire, the more they studied it in secret. Doctors dissected it, writers hinted at it, and artists painted it wrapped in allegory. Even the popular press thrived on moral scandal, printing outraged editorials about the very subjects readers craved. London's tabloid appetite for fallen women, wayward sons and improper conduct turned sin into entertainment disguised as warning. In drawing rooms, conversation danced around forbidden topics like a polite ghost. If someone mentioned Paris, half the room blushed. If someone said Freud, the other half pretended not to hear. He was still a few decades away from fame, but the Victorians didn't need him to invent repression, they'd already mastered it. At dinner, you'd eat roast beef in silence, while pretending not to notice the marble nymphs on the mantel. Even art had to apologize for the human form. Painters titled nude studies, allegory of innocence, or virtue resting just to pass the censors. And when the Royal Academy exhibited a statue deemed too lifelike, the newspapers scolded it for corrupting public decency. What they didn't mention was that tickets to see it sold out for weeks. The Victorians didn't just moralize, they monetized it. There were chastity belts marketed for adolescents, anti-temptation devices for men, and moral tracts sold door to door. Preachers promised purity in pamphlets that read like thinly veiled curiosity. Whole industries thrived on keeping people terrified of themselves. And yet, despite all this, because of it, the age became paradoxically obsessed. Behind the lace and the sermons, the imagination bloomed wild. People dreamt of what they couldn't name. A glimpse of an ankle, a misplaced compliment, a secret letter. Each small rebellion pulsed with forbidden electricity. By over-policing behavior, Victorian society created the very thrill it wanted to suppress. You begin to see how repression wasn't a moral accident, it was a system. It fed on fear, shame, and curiosity, spinning them into a perfect loop. The more you denied, the more you desired. And the more you desired, the more you denied. It's the oldest psychological trap in the book, wrapped in lace and sanctimony. Some nights, walking through foggy London streets, you can almost hear it, the rustle of skirts, the clipped footsteps of propriety chasing its own shadow. The empire that preached control had built an entire civilization on temptation, and the curtain was just beginning to tremble. You can almost feel the contradiction vibrating in the air. The same empire that mapped the human genome of industry could barely name the parts of its own anatomy. The Victorians weren't just moralists. They were inventors, scientists, engineers. They split atoms, built railways, wired telegraphs across oceans. And yet when it came to the body, suddenly everyone turned medieval again. It was as if the human form were a dangerous wilderness left uncharted, best patrolled by doctors armed with Latin and shame. The medical world of the 19th century was obsessed with classification. Everything needed a label: diseases, impulses, behaviors, even sins. Physicians became moral cartographers, mapping where decency ended and pathology began, and nothing fascinated them quite like desire. They called it the animal instinct, the generative faculty, or the far grimmer vice of self-abuse. You can almost hear the discomfort in their language, too polite to say what they meant, too fixated to leave it alone. The Victorians genuinely believed that lust could be measured, diagnosed, and cured. Doctors wrote earnest papers claiming that excessive stimulation caused insanity, paralysis, even death. Hospitals introduced entire departments devoted to moral hygiene. One particularly enthusiastic inventor patented an electric belt that claimed to restore male virtue. The fact that it shocked people into near paralysis didn't seem to bother anyone. It sold by the thousands. Meanwhile, theologians and physicians waged a strange overlapping war. The church preached sin. Science preached degeneration. Different vocabulary, same sermon. A healthy body, they insisted, required moral restraint. The concept of vital energy was everywhere, an invisible fuel that could be wasted through immoral behavior. According to one pamphlet, losing too much vital essence could lead to dullness of mind, tremors of the hand, and weakness of will. If that sounds dramatic, that's because it was. But Victorians didn't laugh. They built an entire moral code around it. Imagine being a young man in that world. Every flicker of desire was treated as a potential symptom. If you confessed to it, you'd be prescribed cold baths, bland diet, and vigorous exercise. Some doctors recommended wearing gloves to bed. Others prescribed sleeping on hard wooden boards. Apparently, comfort itself was corrupting. It's hard not to picture these poor souls pacing their rooms, terrified that a stray thought could ruin their health forever. For women, the situation was stranger still. Female sexuality wasn't demonized so much as erased. Respectable women were expected to feel nothing at all. Those who did were diagnosed as hysterical. And that diagnosis, vague and elastic, became a catch-all for every inconvenient emotion a woman might have. Sadness, anger, boredom, even creativity. Entire clinics emerged to treat hysteria with techniques that sound like parody now, but were deadly serious then. Doctors prescribed rest cures isolation, or in some cases, therapeutic stimulation. They called it science. It was repression dressed in a lab coat. You can see how medicine, morality, and control intertwined until they became indistinguishable. The Victorians didn't simply fear pleasure, they medicalized it. To enjoy one's body was no longer sin, it was illness. And illnesses conveniently required treatment. The irony is breathtaking. An age terrified of the body's power found endless ways to touch measure and study it, just never admit why. But there were cracks in the facade. Not everyone believed the sermons or the science. Some doctors began to whisper about balance rather than abstinence, about the cruelty of blaming natural instincts for imaginary diseases. Writers began hinting at the hypocrisy people like George Eliot and Thomas Hardy, who understood that love and guilt were twin threads woven through every Victorian marriage. They never said it outright, but the suggestion was enough to unsettle polite readers. And somewhere in all this noise, a new tension began to grow, not between man and woman, but between what could be seen and what must never be spoken. Friendships between men, intense and emotional, were celebrated publicly as noble bonds of brotherhood. But if those same friendships hinted at physical affection, the vocabulary vanished. Doctors called it inversion. Theologians called it unnatural, and society called it unspeakable. The word homosexual hadn't even entered English yet, but the fear of it already haunted the room. If you leafed through a Victorian medical journal, you'd find pages of case studies written in nervous euphemisms. A gentleman of refined sensibilities, a youth prone to melancholy, an artist with peculiar affections. These weren't diagnoses. They were confessions disguised as science. The doctors thought they were documenting pathology. But what they were really describing was loneliness. People forced to live without a name for who they were. And that's the irony of this so-called enlightened age, an era obsessed with discovery, somehow made ignorance its most sacred virtue. They mapped continents, but not compassion measured skulls, but not shame and confused silence for morality. The Victorians wanted to master the world, but their greatest fear was still the territory beneath their own skin. It begins with a myth the Victorians loved to tell themselves, that men and women were two entirely different species who somehow managed to share one planet. Here comes your hook. A woman was supposed to be an angel, and a man a beast. And together they called it civilization. It's the most famous lie of the 19th century, whispered from pulpits, printed in novels, and sung at weddings. Everyone knew their role. Women were to be moral compasses, pure and decorative, while men were expected to wrestle with their darker instincts so long as they did it discreetly. You can imagine the pressure this created. The angel in the house. A phrase from Coventry Patmore's famous poem wasn't just an ideal, it was a job description. A woman's virtue was her currency, her reputation, her livelihood. Step outside the script, and she became fallen, a word that could end a life faster than poverty. Meanwhile, men were told their urges were natural, inevitable, even necessary. They were warned to behave, but quietly congratulated when they didn't. The result, a moral equation where women carried the blame for men's desires. In homes, this double standard seeped into everything. A wife might be praised for modesty while her husband kept a mistress. A daughter might be lectured on purity while her brother was sent to gain experience before marriage. Whole families revolved around appearances. Virtue wasn't about goodness. It was about optics. You can almost hear the hypocrisy creak under the weight of its own corset. And corsets, oh yes, those literal cages of bone and lace, became symbols of the system itself. They cinched women's waists and, metaphorically, their freedom. The tighter the laces, the higher the respectability. Fashion turned control into beauty. Even fainting became fashionable because delicate women were considered more virtuous. You can see how a culture terrified of the body found ways to make suffering elegant. Writers of the day reinforced the myth. Novels like Jane Eyre or Middlemarch gave readers heroines who struggled between duty and desire, but always ended by choosing morality or tragedy. There was no middle ground. A good woman could not want, and a bad woman could not love. Meanwhile, male characters were allowed to sin, repent, and be applauded for their complexity. Victorian literature was moral theater staged for an audience desperate to see its own virtue reflected back. But even the best performances have cracks. Behind the angelic ideal lay real women with restless minds and bodies. Some began to rebel in small ways through writing travel education or quiet defiance. George Eliot, who lived openly with a man while unmarried, scandalized society but refused to hide. Her very name was a pseudonym. Mary Ann Evans reinvented herself to be heard in a man's world. The irony, she wrote novels about truth. Doctors ever eager to categorize labeled independent women nervous or hysterical. The logic was simple. If a woman didn't conform, she must be sick. Medical textbooks warned that studying too hard could damage female fertility. One physician even claimed that the stress of reading philosophy could shrink the uterus. You can laugh now, but that theory kept thousands of women out of universities. Knowledge itself became a form of rebellion. And beneath all this, the hypocrisy multiplied. London was full of fallen women, the polite term for prostitutes numbering in the tens of thousands. The same men who condemned immorality by day funded it by night. Parliament even passed the Contagious Diseases Act's laws, allowing police to arrest and medically inspect anyone suspected of vice, while her male clients went unpunished. Disease became a moral metaphor. Sin was contagious, but apparently only for women. You might wonder how anyone kept a straight face through this circus of contradictions. The answer is, they didn't. Satirists like Punch magazine mocked prudery by exaggerating it. Caricatures showed clergymen fainting at piano legs, or ladies covering mirrors to avoid temptation. Humor became the only safe rebellion against hypocrisy. It let people laugh without admitting what they were laughing at. Yet for all the absurdity, this moral code had real casualties. The ideal of the pure woman didn't just repress desire, it erased identity. Entire generations were taught that love was duty, not joy. Intimacy became an obligation, not a connection. When desire inevitably surfaced, it arrived with guilt attached to poison no one could admit they'd swallowed. If you peel back the velvet drapes and the candlelight, you see a civilization divided against itself, a society that built altars to purity, but thrived on transgression. The double standard was its backbone and its downfall. The Victorians didn't invent hypocrisy, they industrialized it. As night settles over the lamp-lit streets of London, you can almost hear the rhythm of its contradictions, sermons booming from pulpits, while carriages rolled toward pleasure districts. Shop windows displaying porcelain angels, while a few blocks away, the city's shadows whisper the truth. It's not morality that defines this age, it's the constant, exhausting performance of it. It starts with a glance too long for comfort. Two soldiers on watch beneath the red and white flag of Empire boots, sunk in mud rifles leaning against the wall. One laughs a little too softly at the other's joke. Nobody notices because nobody dares to. You've stepped into a world where feelings between men are perfectly acceptable so long as they don't have names. The army that iron spine of Victorian Britain runs on brotherhood. But sometimes brotherhood gets too close to the fire. The British Army in the 19th century was a strange family. Men lived together for years, marched together, slept shoulder to shoulder in tents bathed in the same tin basins, and shared everything but secrets. You ate from the same pot, borrowed each other's letters from home. And when fear crept in at night, you pretended that a hand on your shoulder was only friendship. Manly affection, they called it. It was encouraged, celebrated, even as proof of discipline and loyalty. Only later would the same gestures be recast as sins. On campaign from India to the Sudan, loneliness followed soldiers like a second uniform. Months without women, years without privacy. Men learned to lean on each other, not just for safety, but for sanity. Letters home speak of dear companions and brothers of the heart. Some sound almost like love letters, though written in the language of duty. One corporal in the Boer War wrote, "He sleeps beside me every night." I could not wish for kinder company. No one then would have called it romantic, yet the tenderness is unmistakable. Victorian culture left no space for emotional intimacy between men that wasn't wrapped in honor. The army used it, polished it, and weaponized it. Generals spoke of the manly virtues of comradeship. Statues were raised to fallen brothers. Even death on the battlefield became a kind of sacred embrace. It's odd to think how an empire so terrified of love between men depended entirely on it to survive. Without that closeness, regiments would have collapsed. But beyond the medals and the speeches, there was a quieter truth. When the campfire burned low and the songs gave way to silence, many soldiers felt something they couldn't describe. The English language didn't yet offer a word for it. Homosexual wouldn't appear in medical texts until the 1890s, imported awkwardly from German. Before that, there was only unnatural vice, a phrase so loaded it could destroy a man's life. The mere accusation was enough to end a career, or worse. The Army's records list dozens of men discharged for immoral conduct, a tidy euphemism that meant exile and disgrace. Still, affection persisted in the shadows and the small rituals no regulation could erase. The way one soldier would polish another's boots before inspection. The way they shared a single cigarette, not because they lacked tobacco, but because it felt like communion. In barracks across the empire, these quiet gestures formed a code more binding than orders. To outsiders, it looked like discipline. To those inside, it was survival. Sometimes, these bonds outlived the war. Old letters in dusty museums tell the stories, one from a gunner to a comrade he called my other self, another from an officer who kept his friend's photograph folded beneath his medals for 30 years. The words are careful, restrained, but heavy with feeling. When you read them aloud, you realize they were writing what they couldn't say. That love stripped of permission becomes poetry by necessity. You can almost picture them, years later, sitting in pubs back home laughing too loudly, pretending the world hadn't changed. Victorian society expected soldiers to return as heroes, but demanded they erase half of what kept them alive. The public wanted bravery, not tenderness. So they stayed silent, turning memory into discipline, affection into nostalgia. History remembers the battles. It forgets the quiet acts of devotion that happened between them. Modern readers sometimes ask, was it really love? Or just the closeness of men under pressure? But that's the wrong question. In a time when words were forbidden, actions had to carry their own vocabulary. A glance, a gift, a promise before dawn. These became entire sentences in a language lost to time. Love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just lingers unnamed between uniforms and unspoken vows. In the end, it wasn't the body that made their love dangerous. It was the silence around it. Victorian England could forgive violence faster than tenderness. It built an empire on command and control. But intimacy, real, equal human connection, was the one frontier it refused to conquer. And so, in the flicker of a candle in some faraway camp, two men sit side by side pretending to talk about rations. The firelight trembles, the night wind hums through the canvas, and for a fleeting second, the world outside disappears. There's no sin here, no law, no sermon, only the fragile truth that even in an age of repression, hearts still find their way to speak. By now you know the Victorian world had a double heartbeat, one pulsing in public with sermons and ceremony, and one trembling underneath, alive with everything that couldn't be said. Nowhere was that contradiction louder than in London. The city was a moral paradox, wrapped in fog, half cathedral, half carnival, where respectability slept beside sin and pretended not to notice. If you walked its streets after midnight, you'd find the real metropolis, the one that never appeared on postcards. Gas lamps flickered on wet cobblestones. Hansom cabs rolled by like ghosts. And from behind shuttered windows came the soft rhythm of a city hiding its own pulse. To live in Victorian London was to perform purity by day and chase temptation by night. The underworld of desire was vast and organized. There were brothels for every class and every taste, from velvet-draped mansions in St. John's Wood to damp cellars in Whitechapel. There were women who sold illusion, men who sold discretion, and an entire black market that thrived on secrets. The city's so-called moral guardians spoke of vice as if it were an infection, but they themselves were the disease's best customers. One social reformer estimated that by 1865, London's sex trade employed more people than the Royal Navy. It was, in its own twisted way, an economy of loneliness. But not all of the city's forbidden pleasures were heterosexual. Hidden behind the respectable facades of gentlemen's clubs and coffee houses was a quieter network of private lodgings, rented rooms, and taverns, where men who loved men could exist, if only for an evening. They called them molly houses in the previous century. By the 1800s, the term had faded, but the places hadn't. They were still there disguised as meeting halls or literary societies. In these dim rooms, the rules of the empire dissolved. There men found refuge from the performance outside. The talk was coded. The laughter cautious, but the relief was real. You could hear stories of sailors and soldiers, of clerks and poets, all drawn to the same dangerous comfort companionship. No one used the word gay. It didn't exist yet, but they understood each other perfectly. The price of belonging, though, was constant fear. Police raids were frequent and brutal. A single accusation of gross indecency could ruin a man forever. Newspapers printed names gleefully, and the public devoured each scandal like communion. Some men fled abroad, others married women as camouflage. A few, broken by humiliation, simply disappeared. The government claimed it was defending morality. What it really defended was its own ability to pretend. Yet, even in danger, people found ways to live. A certain cafe near the Strand became known as a meeting spot for confirmed bachelors. A tailor on Piccadilly kept a back room where letters could be left and collected anonymously. These places formed a secret geography of survival. Each door, each alley, each glance became a coordinate on an invisible map known only to those who needed it. Not everyone condemned these hidden worlds. Some artists and intellectuals, weary of hypocrisy, began to flirt with forbidden themes in their work. The pre-Raphaelites painted saints who looked suspiciously sensual. Poets filled their verses with longing too tender to be purely brotherly. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Though American found its way into London drawing rooms and was read in whispers by men who recognized themselves in its open, apologetic affection, desire had found its literature. It just had to travel in disguise. What's striking is how society needed these shadows. The public scorned them, but without them, the performance of purity collapsed. Every scandal became proof that decency was under attack, and that kept the moral machine turning. Outrage was a kind of entertainment. The middle class, starved for distraction, devoured moral panic like gossip. Each raid, each rumor, each ruined name became another parable for dinner table discussion. It's easy now to think of Victorian repression as cold or joyless, but that's only half the story. The truth is, it was feverish. To live in that age was to exist in constant contradiction, to be both aroused and ashamed, curious and terrified. That tension wasn't an accident. It was the system. The empire built its authority on control of nations, of women, of the body itself. Desire, being uncontrollable, became its greatest threat. Picture a young clerk walking home past midnight, coat collar turned up, heart pounding. Maybe he passes a doorway where laughter drifts from a lit room. Maybe he hesitates just for a second before walking on. Maybe he goes in. No one will ever know. What's certain is that his story was multiplied by thousands across the city every night. every class, every accent. The Victorians didn't eliminate temptation. They gave it an address. By dawn, the fog would thicken, washing away footprints and names alike. The city would wake up pure again on the surface. Policemen tipped their helmets, milkmen clattered along the streets, and church bells rang like confession. But London's other heart kept beating underground, steady as breath. You can almost hear it now, the sound of a civilization whispering to itself, afraid of its own reflection. London, 1895. Gas lamps outside the Old Bailey flicker like nervous candles, and inside the Empire's most famous playwright sits in the dock, his wit, his elegance, and his private life on trial. You're here for the case of Oscar Wilde, and nothing captures Victorian hypocrisy quite like this. The same society that adored him for his charm now burns him for his truth. The courtroom is packed. Reporters, moral crusaders, curious spectators pretending outrage while hoping for scandal. You can almost feel the heat of their self-righteousness. They'd come not for justice, but for entertainment. The judge, stone-faced, stares down at Wilde, whose very posture radiates defiance. The prosecutor waves letters as evidence, calling them grossly indecent. What they really are, love letters. Words written with tenderness, wrapped in metaphor, never obscene yet damning in a world that feared affection between men, more than it feared cruelty itself. Imagine the tension in the room as Wilde, instead of denying, defends beauty, emotion, and the right to love. His voice doesn't tremble. The love that dare not speak its name, he says, is that noble affection between an older and a younger man. Such as there was between David and Jonathan, such as Plato made the very basis of his philosophy. The silence afterward is heavy, almost holy. He's quoting the Bible and the classics to defend what the law calls perversion. It's the bravest, most foolish sermon ever preached in a courtroom. But the Empire wasn't listening. It had already chosen its scapegoat. Wilde wasn't just being punished for who he loved. He was being punished for saying it out loud. The newspapers printed his downfall like serialized fiction. One headline read, "Apostle of Aestheticism Unmasked." His plays were pulled from theaters, his name erased from posters, his friends vanished overnight. It's one of those moments when a civilization tries to make an example of a man, not realizing he's already become a symbol. Outside the court, the world moved on, but something had cracked. People began to talk quietly, cautiously about the trial, about the law, about how a society so obsessed with beauty could destroy its greatest artist for loving it too honestly. The hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. In private clubs, men whispered Wilde's lines like forbidden scripture. To love oneself, he'd written, is the beginning of a lifelong romance. It was meant as irony, but now it sounded like survival advice. The trial didn't invent fear, it revealed it. For decades, the law against gross indecency had existed like a ghost clause invoked only when the public needed someone to hate. It didn't matter whether the accused were artists, soldiers, or servants. The punishment was the same: ruin. Even those never caught lived with constant paranoia. Every glance, every gesture had to be censored before someone else could. Wilde's conviction turned that quiet dread into a spectacle. The irony, of course, is that the Victorians adored what Wilde represented. They loved with elegance, beauty, the very qualities they claimed to despise in him. The upper class decorated drawing rooms with Greek statues, praised Shakespeare's sonnets to young men, and studied Plato's Symposium without ever admitting what those texts celebrated. They wanted art without the artist's beauty, without desire. Wilde, dazzling and unapologetic, made that impossible. He made the mask fall off. His sentence, 2 years of hard labor, was less about justice than humiliation. They wanted to break him physically, to turn brilliance into repentance. And yet from his cell in Reading jail, he wrote to Profundus a letter that reads like a confession to history itself. In it, he doesn't beg for forgiveness. He redefines sorrow as clarity. Where there is suffering, he wrote, there is holy ground. For a man condemned by moralists, he understood morality far better than they ever could. Even after his release, the damage lingered. Wilde lived in exile penniless, his health ruined, his reputation untouchable. But time, as it often does, took sides. Within a few decades, his works returned to the stage, his words carved into memory, his name reclaimed by generations who saw in him not scandal, but courage. The Victorians wanted to silence him. Instead, they made him immortal. And what about the society that condemned him? It didn't repent. It evolved by pretending it hadn't been cruel. The newspapers that mocked him later praised his genius. The same empire that jailed him would within half a century quote his epigrams as wisdom. Hypocrisy, after all, has a long shelf life. But the trial did something the judges never intended. It gave a shape to silence. Before Wilde, there was only rumor and shame. After him, there was a name, a face, a tragedy people could no longer deny. His fall cracked the marble facade of Victorian virtue and revealed the trembling humanity beneath. You can still feel his presence in that courtroom, the man who refused to apologize for loving beauty in a world terrified of it. The walls might have echoed with condemnation, but somewhere between the judge's gavel and the reporter's pen, something else was born. The first public glimpse of a truth that would one day refuse to stay hidden. By the end of the 19th century, the battle for morality had found a new general science. The priests had thundered about sin. Now doctors whispered about sickness. The vocabulary changed, but the message didn't. What used to be called vice was now labeled pathology. You could almost hear the sigh of relief in polite society. They no longer had to condemn, they could simply diagnose. Medical journals brimmed with new terminology. Sexual inversion, perversion, degeneration. These weren't words of hatred, at least not at first. They were words of curiosity, wrapped in lab coats and Latin. The Victorians, with their endless appetite for classification, had finally turned their gaze inward. They had mapped the colonies, the oceans, the stars, and now they were trying to map the soul. You can picture the lecture halls of London and Vienna, filled with men in waistcoats, scribbling notes as if charting a moral epidemic. One doctor claimed that inverts could be spotted by a peculiar softness of voice and expression. Another declared that such people were neither male nor female, but a tragic blend of both. There was no malice in the phrasing, just the arrogance of certainty. They thought they were discovering nature's secrets. In truth, they were inventing stigma. The new discipline of psychiatry promised answers. It also gave society a new mask. Instead of punishing people for sinning, it offered to cure them. Treatments ranged from the ridiculous to the cruel. Cold baths, electric shocks, isolation, hypnosis, even surgery. The goal was to transform shame into science, guilt into therapy. And yet behind all that white coat confidence, the same Victorian terror remained fear of losing control. It's tempting to sneer at their ignorance, but remember, many of these doctors were genuinely trying to understand something they'd been taught to fear since birth. They had no words, no examples, no permission to imagine that love might exist outside their narrow definitions. They dissected the human heart like it was a malfunctioning engine, then wondered why it didn't run on reason. Meanwhile, literature was quietly doing what medicine couldn't, telling the truth. Writers began weaving coded explorations of forbidden desire into fiction. Havelock Ellis's studies in the psychology of sex appeared in 1897, the first English work to argue that same-sex attraction wasn't a disease, but a variation of human nature. It was banned immediately, of course, but copies spread hand to hand like contraband scripture. Imagine being one of those readers, finally seeing yourself described not as a monster, but as human. The irony is that the same society that locked Wilde in a cell now devoured books about moral degeneration. People were fascinated by what they claimed to despise. Magazines printed scandalous pseudo-scientific essays about the new abnormality. Artists painted languid figures with androgynous faces and called it symbolism. Desire was no longer just forbidden, it had become fashionable as long as it stayed tragic. In drawing rooms, intellectuals debated whether inversion was a matter of nature or nurture. Some declared it hereditary, others the result of overeducation, or believe it or not, too much reading. The press nicknamed it the Oscar Wilde disease. Medical men spoke gravely of contagion. The idea that affection could spread like an infection both thrilled and terrified the public. It made desire sound dangerous again, and danger, as every Victorian knew, was irresistibly exciting. And so the pendulum swung between fascination and fear. Clinics filled with patients who didn't need curing, but who came anyway, desperate to be made normal. Families paid fortunes to have sons treated quietly. Women diagnosed as hysterical were subjected to therapeutic procedures that blurred the line between medicine and assault. The language of healing became another form of control. But even in this climate, courage flickered. Edward Carpenter, a poet and philosopher, began writing openly about love between men as natural and even spiritual. Living quietly with his partner George Merrill in the English countryside, Carpenter became a ghost of the future, an early prophet of self-acceptance in an age of panic. His essays spoke of affection as the meeting of souls, not the clashing of bodies. Most Victorians ignored him. A few understood exactly what he meant. Every generation has its blind spots, and for the Victorians, the greatest one was this: they mistook complexity for corruption. They believed naming something gave them power over it, but each new label only deepened the confusion. The doctors thought they were curing sickness. What they were really treating was loneliness, the loneliness of being unacknowledged, of existing outside the vocabulary of decency. By the century's end, moral panic had become a national pastime. From pulpits to press rooms, from asylum wards to private letters, the same battle raged between curiosity and control, compassion and fear. The Victorians wanted answers, but what they found was reflection proof that repression hadn't purified them at all. It had simply given their obsessions a scientific name. You can almost hear the echo of it now. The scratch of a fountain pen in a dimly lit study, the rustle of a doctor's papers, the heartbeat of someone sitting in the next room waiting to be told whether they're human or ill. The clock ticks. Outside, London's fog presses against the windows, soft and cold. The century is ending, but the silence isn't. By now, the curtain of Victorian respectability is beginning to fray. Behind the grand houses, between the soft ticking of parlor clocks, life keeps whispering what the sermons refuse to say. You start to notice that the real stories of the age aren't written in newspapers or sermons, but in diaries. Thin volumes hidden beneath mattresses and desk drawers and trunks sealed for private viewing only. Inside them lies everything the Victorians couldn't admit aloud. A husband writes of a wife he barely knows, her body cold beside him each night. A governess writes of another woman, her admiration laced with fear. A soldier back from India writes of a comrade he can't stop dreaming about. None of these people would have called it rebellion. They were simply trying to breathe within the narrow air of their century. Victorian marriage, for all its lace and legality, was often a contract of silence. The ideal household resembled a museum, everything polished, nothing alive. You can almost picture it, the heavy drapes, the china cabinet gleaming like an altar. The husband reading the Times while his wife embroiders in perfect stillness. Respectability had replaced intimacy. Love had become a performance staged for the neighbors. And yet beneath that stillness, hearts moved. Letters between long-separated spouses sometimes flare with surprising tenderness. Others between companions pulse with longing carefully disguised as friendship. The word dear did heavy lifting in Victorian correspondence. It could mean anything from polite affection to secret devotion. When emotion couldn't be named, people built whole codes to carry it. One remarkable example lies in the life of Anne Lister, a Yorkshire landowner whose coded diaries chronicled her love for women decades before the word lesbian existed in polite English. Written in a private cipher that mixed Greek letters and algebraic symbols, her journals recorded her world, as it was discreet, clever, resilient. In one entry she wrote, "I love and only love the fairer sex, and thus beloved by them, in turn my heart revolts from any other love." Those words, unread in her time, feel like a confession sent to the future. Even in homes that looked ordinary, tiny rebellions glimmered. Couples found ways to rewrite the rules, some married for friendship, others for convenience. And a few simply coexisted with quiet understanding. The Victorians were great believers in facades, but facades, as every architect knows, eventually crack under weather. You can almost hear it in the fiction of the time, those long, sighing paragraphs in novels where characters talk about duty while staring out windows. They weren't just waiting for someone. They were waiting for permission. Outside the cities and the countryside and colonies, things could be freer and stranger. In remote outposts of the empire, officers formed intense bonds that went unremarked upon, so long as the paperwork looked proper. On tropical plantations or desert stations, miles from London's moral gaze, affection between men or between masters and servants sometimes flourished in quiet, half-understood ways. There were no witnesses but the night sky, no language but gesture. Empire expanded geography, but not imagination. Even at the edge of the world, shame traveled with them. The great irony of Victorian intimacy is that the more people hid, the more they recorded. The century that preached discretion also invented photography, postcards, and cheap paper, all tools for confession. A single photograph of two men arm in arm might mean nothing, or everything. Scholars today find these images and hesitate to label them. Were they friends, lovers? Does it even matter? Maybe that uncertainty is the truest reflection of the age love, so forbidden it had to disguise itself as virtue. And then there were the artists, the quiet witnesses of all this contradiction. Painters like Simeon Solomon, whose biblical scenes shimmered with tenderness between men, and poets who filled their verses with ambiguous pronouns to protect themselves from scandal. You can sense the ache in their restraint, the creative brilliance forced to tiptoe through a moral minefield. They weren't hiding because they lacked courage. They were hiding because the world lacked mercy. Sometimes reading their words today feels like listening to someone whisper through a wall. You want to answer back to tell them that the world eventually learned new words, softer ones, kinder ones. But for them, silence was safety. They made art out of what they couldn't speak, and that art strangely beautifully survived when their names did not. In the end, the private life of the Victorians was anything but dull. Beneath all the etiquette manuals and lace tablecloths, there was longing, raw, clumsy human longing that refused to die quietly. The empire could regulate trade, literature, even thought, but not the heart. That was its one unconquered province. As you turn one of those fragile diary pages, the ink faded, but still legible. It's impossible not to feel the warmth of those who wrote them. They lived surrounded by noise, yet most of them died unheard. And still the paper remembers. The scratches of a quill in candlelight, the trembling punctuation, the pauses where words failed, all of it. Proof that even in an age of silence, love kept finding its way onto the page. The century that dressed its fears in lace has finally run out of thread. It's the 1890s now, the end of the Victorian age, and something fragile but unstoppable is shifting in the air. You can feel it in the flicker of gaslight, against the new electric bulbs, and the way people begin speaking. Just a little too loudly, laughing, just a little too freely. The empire still stands, but its voice has started to crack. For the first time, people are daring to ask not what is moral, but what is real. You walk the streets of London and notice posters for new plays, Shaw Ibsen Wilde before the fall plays, that talk about women's independence, social hypocrisy, even forbidden love. The critics call them immoral, which in Victorian English usually means true. The same theaters that once bowed to censorship now flirt with defiance. Outside suffragists march for the vote. Inside intellectuals debate Freud's early theories about the unconscious, the idea that repression doesn't erase desire, it just drives it underground. The irony isn't lost on anyone. The Victorians had built their entire civilization underground. In parlors and universities, the first cracks of liberation appear not as shouts, but as murmurs. Writers like Edward Carpenter, Havelock Ellis, and Olive Schreiner begin publishing works that argue for sexual honesty, gender equality, and emotional truth. Their books circulate quietly, sometimes burned, sometimes banned, but always read. For every copy confiscated, 3 more are passed from hand to hand like contraband hope. You can almost see the torchlight of a new century approaching, faint but steady. Women, too, begin to demand more than angelic roles. The new woman enters literature educated, independent, sometimes scandalous. She rides a bicycle, smokes in public, and refuses to faint on cue. Conservatives panic, claiming the end of civilization is at hand. They're half right. What's ending isn't civilization, it's the performance of it. The age of pretense is crumbling under the weight of its own corset strings. Even the artists start to rebel more openly. The aesthetic movement born from Wilde's ashes declares that beauty needs no moral justification. Painters depict bodies without apology. Poets celebrate love without gender. In music halls, comedians mock prudishness. In cafes, radicals debate the woman question and the inversion problem with the same energy Victorians once reserved for empire building. It's messy, inconsistent, but real, the first breath after a long suffocation. You might think the moralists won, but history tells a different story. Every law they passed, every sermon they shouted, only postponed what was inevitable, the return of honesty. Repression can muffle truth, but it can't erase it. The Victorians spent a century burying their desires under etiquette and diagnosis, only to discover that silence, too, can become an obsession. By the century's end, their children had grown tired of whispering. Even Queen Victoria herself couldn't hold back the tide. She'd lived long enough to see the bicycle craze scandalize society, women's colleges open, and art turn decadent in defiance of all that was proper. It is tempting to picture her frowning disapproval. But perhaps she was simply bewildered, a ruler watching her empire of manners slip through her gloved fingers. The new voices of the fin de siècle didn't destroy Victorian morality overnight. They simply stopped apologizing for curiosity. They began to treat the human heart not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be understood. It was the first step towards something radical: compassion. The same century that punished wild and silenced millions would in its final breath plant the seeds of a freer world. You can imagine it now, the gaslights dimming the carriages, replaced by early motor cars, the cobblestones glistening with the drizzle of a new century. The moral lectures fade, replaced by jazz cinema psychoanalysis. But traces of the Victorians remain: their contradictions, their guilt, their longing. Every modern idea of privacy, romance, or self-expression is built on the bones of their repression. We inherited not just their inventions, but their secrets. And yet maybe that's fitting, because for all their fear, the Victorians never stopped wanting to understand themselves. They just didn't have the language for it. That language of love, without shame, of honesty, without punishment, was still being written one whisper at a time. The curtain falls on their century, not with applause, but with a sigh. The gaslight dims. The lace curtains flutter, and the world exhales after holding its breath for 100 years. Somewhere in a quiet room, a diary closes. A candle goes out, and a new century begins to dream of honesty, of freedom, of a love that no longer needs to hide. The century turns the lace, and whispers fade, and now the stage belongs to the hands that built it all. The factories hum, the chimneys breathe, and the real heartbeat of Victorian Britain is no longer in parlors, it's in the streets. So slip on your soot-stained boots. Let's see what a single day feels like in the life of a Victorian worker. You wake up to the sound of dripping again. It's not rain, though. Heaven knows it rains every other day. It's just the slow leak above your bed, tapping into the same tin pan that's been filling since last week. You stare at it for a moment, trying to guess how long until it overflows. That you think might be the only thing in this room that works on schedule. The air is thick with damp and smoke, a blend of last night's boiled cabbage and the coal soot that seeps through everything. The mattress beneath you is more straw than sack now, and the blanket has the texture of sandpaper that's seen better years. But still, you made it through another night without freezing solid. In Victorian England, that's practically a victory worth writing home about, if you had stamps or paper or a home worth writing to. Outside, a church bell tolls somewhere deep in the fog. You know the rhythm before your brain even catches up. It's 4:30. That means you're already late. The shift horn at the mill screams in half an hour, and it doesn't wait for dreamers or drizzle. You swing your legs off the bed and feel the floorboards sigh. Cold bites your feet like small, polite dogs, sharp enough to remind you you're alive, but not quite enough to kill the feeling. You reach for your shirt stiff with yesterday's sweat and pull it over your head. The fabric smells faintly of oil and machine dust. You'd like to wash it, but water costs, soap costs, time costs, and you already owe all three. You button it up anyway. The mirror beside the window gives back a face the color of pale bread dough and eyes that look older than they should. You rub your chin and joke quietly to yourself. Handsome devil, aren't you? The mirror doesn't answer, which is probably for the best. The room around you is barely big enough to turn around in. There's a stove in the corner, long since dead, and a cracked mug that doubles as your basin. You pour in a splash of cold water from the jug, just enough to wipe your face. It stings, but at least it wakes you. A neighbor coughs somewhere through the wall, a wet chest-deep sound that never seems to end. Half the street coughs like that. They call it the factory lung. Doctors have names for it too, but none that fix it. You tiptoe around your sleeping sister wrapped in a blanket by the stove. She's 12 but looks 9. She'll join the mill next year when she's old enough, which really just means when she can reach the levers without standing on a crate. You envy her a little the first year, always seems easy until it isn't. You slip outside quietly, boots in hand not to wake the landlord's wife. Rent day's tomorrow, and she has the hearing of a fox when it comes to coins. You tug the doors shut behind you, step into the misty morning, and only then let out a long, steaming sigh. The street greets you with Puddle's rats and a smell like boiled leather. A lamplighter in the distance snuffs the last of the gas lamps, his silhouette wobbling in the haze. The cobblestones glisten with a kind of grim beauty. Silver puddles, coal dust glittering faintly like frost. It would almost look poetic if it didn't smell like sewage. You walk past rows of identical tenements, each one leaning a little as if they're all too tired to stand straight anymore. Somewhere a baby cries. Somewhere else a door slams and a man swears softly. Life is already in motion before the sun even bothers to show up. Your stomach growls. You fish a piece of bread from your coat pocket, stale, hard, but edible, and chew slowly, imagining butter. Some mornings you fancy you can actually taste it. On better days, when your pay isn't docked for lateness or breakages, you might even get a bit of dripping from the butcher's fat trimmings. But not today. Today is a make-do and move-on kind of morning. As you round the corner onto the main road, you pass the rag and bone man pushing his cart through the gloom, calling out rags, bones, bottles in a voice that sounds as old as the cobbles. He nods to you, and you nod back, the unspoken greeting of people too tired to bother with words. It's strange, you think, how quickly this life becomes routine. The smell of coal smoke that once made you gag now feels like home. The aching joints, just another kind of weather. Sometimes you even catch yourself admiring the way the fog softens everything, the filth, the noise, even the fear. Then again, maybe that's how the city survives, by blurring the edges until you stop seeing how sharp they really are. You pull your cap lower, tuck your bread crust back in your pocket, and head for the sound of the factory horn, echoing like a warning from the belly of the beast. The street widens into a gray blur of motion boots, hooves, and wheels, all grinding through the morning fog. The city feels alive in the strangest way, not like a body but like a machine that eats people for fuel. Every step you take feels like another gear turning somewhere. You can almost hear the metal teeth clicking carriages clatter over cobbles. Hawkers call out bread and fish, and somewhere nearby a boy shouts the headlines. Another mine collapse. 16 dead. Nobody stops to listen. The smell of coal smoke thickens until it coats your tongue. You pass a row of brick chimneys. Coughing black clouds into the dawn, and it's like walking through the lungs of a giant. Across the street, a milkman's horse flicks its tail, splattering mud on a young clerk's trousers. He curses under his breath, dabs at the stain with a handkerchief, and glares as if the horse had done it out of malice. You can't help but grin. Even misery has its little comedies. You step carefully around a heap of manure, then a puddle that looks shallow but isn't. The soles of your boots are thin enough that you can feel the cold seeping through. Beside you, an old woman balances a basket of washing on her head, muttering about rent. A group of boys run past, swinging their caps and chasing one another through the smoke barefoot, happy not yet owned by the factory whistle. You watch them disappear and wonder how long that freedom lasts. As you near the mill, the city starts to change. The houses grow taller, narrower, squeezed tight like teeth in a crooked jaw. The windows are lined with grime, and every now and then You spot a curtain twitching, someone peering out, with that weary suspicion people get when poverty turns privacy into luxury. It's funny you think how everyone here lives so close together and still manages to feel completely alone. The closer you get, the louder the sound becomes. It starts as a hum, then a drone, then a full-blown thunder. The factory's heart is beating, and you're late enough to feel it in your ribs. You pick up your pace boots splashing and join the flow of other workers funneling toward the gates. Men in flat caps, women with scarves knotted under their chins, boys barely old enough to shave each one, moving like they've been wound up by the same key. Someone bumps your shoulder hard enough to make you stumble. You glance back, but the man doesn't even notice. He's too busy keeping his eyes on the looming brick mass ahead, the mill itself a fortress of industry, black-streaked and humming windows glowing with pale fire. You think of it sometimes like a god, loud, hungry, and impossible to please. A bell rings from the tower, one long metallic roar, and the crowd surges forward. At the gate stands the overseer, coat button pocket watch, gleaming face set like stone. His name's Mr. Crowther. He can spot a late worker at 50 yards. You've seen him dock pay for 5 minutes delay. Once a man tried to slip past after the bell and got sent home without a penny for the week. He never came back. You're not sure if that counts as freedom or punishment. You show your brass token at the gate number 132, and the clerk scratches it off the list. That's your name for the day. Not John, not Thomas, not you, but 132. You tuck it back in your pocket anyway. Numbers don't care if you're tired. They don't cough, they don't ache, they just keep showing up. Inside the courtyard smells of oil and steam. Carts rattle past carrying bales of cotton under tarps, each one leaking white fluff like snow. For a second, you imagine what it might look like to someone far away. How beautiful it must seem, the miracle of industry, the glory of the empire. You almost laugh. If only they could smell it. A whistle shrieks again, higher this time, and a foreman waves his arm. The workers scatter to their stations, spinners, carders, weavers, cleaners. You head to the spinning floor where rows of machines stretch out like endless soldiers clacking and thundering in perfect rhythm. The sound is deafening, but after a while, you hardly notice. That's the secret everyone learns, eventually. If you let your mind drift, the noise turns into something almost like music. You take your place by the frame, check the bobbins, and start your shift. Hands move automatically, feeding thread, clearing lint, avoiding the whirring spindles that spin faster than thought. A boy next to you, maybe 11, works with a rag tied around his mouth to keep out the dust. He winks at you when the overseer turns his back, then mimics a pompous walk with his broom like he's on parade. You snort, and he grins wider. Humor, it seems, is still the cheapest form of rebellion. Now and then you catch glimpses through the grimy windows, the faint light of morning, the smoke rolling over rooftops, the horse carts creaking by. You wonder how many of those passers-by ever think about what happens inside these walls. The hum, the heat, the human tide beneath it all. Maybe none. Maybe that's the point. Your thoughts are broken by the overseer's bark eyes on your work, and you snap back to the task. The rhythm resumes. Threads hiss, gears clank, and the great machine swallows another hour whole. Somewhere deep inside, you feel a strange mix of pride and dread. Pride that you can keep up. Dread that you'll always have to. The hours start to melt together, just noise, motion, and muscle memory. Your body does the work while your mind drifts somewhere else, a kind of waking sleep. That's how most people survive here, by letting the noise fill their head until it drowns out the ache. You've seen men talk to the machines as if they were wives. At least the machines respond, even if it's just with steam and rhythm. Every few minutes you glance at the clock mounted high on the wall, but the hands might as well be nailed in place. Time in a Victorian factory doesn't move forward. It grinds sideways. The whistle that marks the lunch break feels like a rumor that never comes true. You check the spindles again, too much slack, and the thread will snap. Too little and the fibers jam, costing you a scolding, maybe a deduction. The air's so thick with cotton dust that it feels like breathing through a pillow. You try not to think about what it's doing to your lungs. Most people here die young, but not fast, just slower every day, one breath at a time. A girl beside you, no older than 14, coughs into her sleeve. She's been doing that all week, and the sleeve's turning gray from the lint she spits into it. "You all right, Annie?" you ask, leaning close so she can hear over the clatter. She nods and says, "Fine," but her eyes say otherwise. Want to believe her, though? It's easier that way. Everyone here says fine because the truth would just slow the machines. The overseer stalks between the rows, his boots crunching on stray thread and sawdust. He carries a short cane, not for beating, at least not officially, but for pointing out inefficiencies. You've seen him tap a worker's shoulder so sharply that it leaves a bruise the shape of his authority. When he passes, you straighten your back automatically. Reflex, not respect. Once you heard about a reformer named Lord Shaftesbury who fought to limit children's working hours. They said he gave speeches in Parliament about kids losing fingers in spinning frames, about girls collapsing from heat and hunger. You even saw his name in the newspaper once next to the word Factory Act. But that law might as well be a fairy tale here. The owner just calls it a suggestion for gentlemen, and none of you work for gentlemen. The machines roar on. You catch yourself daydreaming about sunlight, what it must feel like to stand outside in the middle of the day with no one shouting at you. Maybe just sitting by the canal, watching ripples instead of gears. It's a strange fantasy doing nothing. But here, doing nothing is a luxury only the dead can afford. A shout slices through the noise. Someone's sleeve got caught in a roller. The machine jerks, fabric tears, and for a moment the floor goes still. The overseer runs over barking orders. You can't see much, but you hear the sound that no one forgets, a mix of pain and panic that doesn't belong to animals or men, but something in between. They pull the boy free. He's breathing, at least. A few drops of blood land on the cotton pile, turning it pink. And then, almost as if embarrassed, the machines start again. You look down at your hands. The knuckles are raw, the nails dark with oil. Every scar tells a story you don't remember earning. You wipe your brow with your sleeve, smearing dust into sweat, and think this is what progress looks like. Steam speed and sacrifice. Sometimes when you let your mind wander, you picture the owners, the men whose portraits hang in the office. Clean collars and soft hands, the kind of hands that have never bled from a spindle. They speak of the glory of industry and the power of British innovation. Maybe they even believe it. And to be fair, you suppose they're right in a way. Britain does rule half the world now, and all those rails ships and textiles have to come from somewhere. They just never mention where somewhere is. You steal a glance at the boy who got hurt. He's sitting now, cradling his arm, while another worker wraps it with a strip of cloth. He tries to smile when your eyes meet, like he's apologizing for the noise. You give him a small nod. What else can you do? Hours pass. The light through the grimy windows changes from gray to white to nothing. Someone mutters that it's nearly lunch, but nobody dares slow down until the whistle confirms it. When it finally blows, the sound cuts through the factory like salvation. You set your tools down and stretch your spine, cracking like old timber. Half hour, the overseer yells, and the workers scatter like freed birds. You head for the yard, legs, stiff hands trembling from the vibration still trapped in your bones. You've got 30 minutes to remember what silence sounds like. The whistle for lunch is less a break than a truce, a pause in the war between flesh and iron. You shuffle out with the others into the courtyard, blinking against the sudden gray light. The air outside smells almost clean compared to the mill, though the breeze still tastes faintly of soot. You sink down on a broken crate and unwrap your meal, yesterday's bread, maybe a scrap of cheese if fortune's kind. Today it's just bread. You bite into it anyway. The crust scrapes your gums, and you swear it echoes in your skull. But hunger's not picky, and you chew until it becomes something like food. Across from you, two men share a tin of cold beans, trading stories about the foreman's temper as if he were some mythical beast. He's got eyes in the back of his head, one says. The other grins eye and a heart made of boiler iron. You laugh quietly, though not too loud. Humor's safe, but hope is not. Everywhere you look, people eat like soldiers in the trenches, quick, practical, silent. A few younger boys kick a ball of rags around, laughing until a foreman barks them back to their corners. One girl, maybe 16, sits alone, mending a torn sleeve while she chews. She hums a tune between bites, something that might have been a hymn once before the machines drowned it out. And then, like an intrusion from another world, a carriage rolls past the gates. Inside sits a man in a tall hat, his coat's spotless face serene. You recognize him. Sir Titus Salt, the mill owner who made his fortune on wool. The overseers straighten immediately, hats off, back stiff. The workers stop mid-bite as if politeness would buy them a gentler shift. Sir Titus glances briefly at the yard, then turns away, more interested in his watch than the faces staring back. In a few minutes, he's gone. That's the funny thing about Victorian progress. To the world outside, men like Salt or Arkwright are heroes, the titans who built the empire of smoke and iron. They speak of opportunity and advancement. But for most of you, advancement just means surviving another winter without losing a finger. Still, there's a kind of awe to it. The city hums like one vast engine, and you're a cog inside. Small, yes, but without you, it would stop. Not that anyone ever says thank you. You finish the bread and dust the crumbs from your lap. Your stomach still grumbles, but you've learned to negotiate with hunger like an old acquaintance. You sip water from a dented tin flask and glance up at the clouds, rolling low black as iron wool. The drizzle's coming again. It always does. For a moment, you let yourself imagine something reckless, a world where people work shorter hours, where sunlight isn't a stranger, where lungs stay clean. A world where the mill's roar is replaced by the sound of laughter. It sounds ridiculous, even in your head. But still, you can't help asking, what if? Then the second whistle blows sharp and final, snapping you back to reality. The laughter stops. The chatter fades and the great migration begins again. Lunch is over. Mercy has expired. You fall in line shoulder to shoulder, the same faces, the same steps. Feels like being swallowed. Inside, the heat hits you like a wall. Steam leaks from pipes overhead, mingling with the smell of oil and sweat. The windows are fogged with condensation, turning the world beyond into a blur of pale light. You take your place fingers, already trembling slightly, and the rhythm starts again. This time, the machines seem angrier, louder. The gears grind like teeth, and the floor trembles with their hunger. You feed the fibers into the rollers again and again, faster, tighter. The foreman paces the aisle like a hawk, his boots clicking with authority. A girl drops her bobbin. It rolls under the machinery, and for a heartbeat, she hesitates. Everyone knows what happens if you reach in while it's moving. The stories circulate like ghost tales, hands crushed hair, caught sleeves pulled in until it's too late. But fear doesn't weigh as much as lost wages. She crouches anyway. Don't you shout barely audible over the clatter. But she's already reaching. The roller jerks, and her scream cuts through the din. The machine stops too late. When they pull her free, her arm hangs limp. The floor falls silent. Even the overseer looks pale for once. They carry her out, and the rest of you stand frozen. The whistle blows again, not to end the shift, but to remind you the world hasn't stopped. The overseer clears his throat. Back to work, he says, and walks away. You return to your station in silence. The machine hums, steady, merciless. You move your hands as before, but something feels heavier in the air, like dust that won't settle. You don't know the girl's name, but you'll remember her sleeve bright blue against all this gray. The hours after the accident pass in a fog. The machines roar louder than ever, as if trying to drown the memory of the scream still ringing in your skull. You keep your head down, hands steady, eyes fixed on the spinning thread. It's strange how quickly life here snaps back into rhythm. Pain is just another background noise, like the hiss of steam or the rattle of the frames. When the end-of-shift whistle finally blows for dinner, the sound feels almost unreal. You wipe your hands on your trousers, still half dazed, and follow the others into the damp twilight. The drizzle has turned to full rain, soaking through your coat before you even reach the gate. You wonder if the girl's home now, or the infirmary, more likely. The thought sticks with you, heavy as the mud clinging to your boots. Dinner is a generous word. You find a spot under a narrow awning beside the factory wall where others are already huddled. Someone passes around a tin pail of soup so thin it might as well be flavored water. You take a few sips, taste salt and soot, and nod your thanks. Food isn't about pleasure, it's about staying vertical. A boy with a bandaged hand sits beside you, trying to peel a potato with his teeth. You recognize him, Tommy, the one who joked with you on your first day. They say she'll live, he mutters suddenly. Eyes on the puddle at his feet. The girl. Lost her arm, though. You swallow hard. There's no good answer to that. She's lucky, he adds after a pause. Could have been worse. You nod because that's what people do when the truth's too cruel to argue with. Someone nearby hums a tune low, almost mournful. It's God Save the Queen. Ironic, really. The Queen's face is on every coin that never quite reaches your pocket, smiling serenely, while her empire hums on the blood and sweat of its workers. You wonder if she's ever set foot in a place like this. Probably not. Palaces don't echo like mills do. You tear a piece of bread in half and offer it to Tommy. He hesitates, then takes it, mumbling thanks. His good hand shakes as he eats. You can tell he's feverish, the same red flush you've seen in men who don't last the winter. The overseer passes by just then, sheltered under a large umbrella. His boots don't splash. They glide. He stops briefly to check his pocket watch, frowns, and shouts, 10 minutes left before disappearing into the rain. You exchange a look with Tommy, half amused, half resigned. 10 minutes to rest your bones, to remember you're human before becoming part of the machine again. You glance down the narrow street that runs behind the mill. Children dart between puddles, scavenging bits of coal dropped from passing carts. A woman leans from a window, calling them in for supper. Her voice echoes faintly, soft and tired, the same note carried by every mother in this city. Your stomach growls again, but there's no point in feeding it hope. You chew slowly, swallowing the last of the bread, as if it were a memory you might stretch a little longer. Around you, the talk shifts from injuries to gossip, how the price of coal's going up again, how a man down the street found work at the docks, how someone's cousin emigrated to Canada and made good. That last one always makes the rounds. No one's ever met this cousin, of course. But imagining him out there breathing clean air, working his own land, makes the night feel slightly less heavy. You pull your coat tighter. The rain has softened to mist now, and lamps begin to flicker to life along the street. They glow weakly halos, trembling in the fog like stars trying to remember what brightness feels like. For a fleeting second, it's almost beautiful. Back in Lads, a voice calls, and the illusion shatters. You toss your crust aside and rise. The others groan, stretch, and shuffle toward the gate. Your boots squelch in the mud, each step heavier than the last. You glance once more toward the city lights, in the distance blurred and golden. Somewhere beyond that smoke and rain, people are dining on roast beef and wine, talking about poetry and politics. It's all the same city, technically. Just not the same world. You step through the gate again, the clang of iron behind you sealing the deal. The noise swells, the air grows thick, and the factory resumes its endless breathing. The gears turn, the belts whip, and you slip back into rhythm without thinking. You move, you pull, you feed, you endure. If there's one mercy in all this, it's that the mind eventually stops fighting. The roar becomes background, the ache becomes weather, and even the sadness wears down to something manageable. Like a stone polished smooth by the current, you let the hours wash over you until only shape remains. You lose count of the hours again. The factory floor has no clocks that matter, only whistles, and they rule with the precision of a tyrant. The roar of the machines builds and breaks like waves. You fall into rhythm, same motions, same breath, until your body moves faster than thought. Then it happens again. A sharp crack followed by a cry that slices through the steam. This time it's not a child, but an older man, one of the weavers. His sleeves caught between the belts, dragging him forward before anyone can blink. The machine shudders, jerks, then stops, smoke curling from the friction. People freeze. You can't even hear the rain outside anymore, just the sound of his breathing, harsh and quick. The overseer pushes through the crowd. Everyone back, he barks. His cane jabs the air like punctuation. Two men rush in to help, hands slick with grease and panic. They free the man's arm, and the sleeve falls away, dark with blood. You look down, not out of fear, but because there's nothing you can do. The smell of oil mixed with iron fills the room. A doctor arrives, a real one, though not the kind with letters after his name. More like a fixer for the factory, paid by the owner to patch up what the machines break. He binds the man's arm with strips of linen and mutters, "Lucky it's only muscle." The man groans, face pale, and they carry him off. The overseer watches for exactly 5 seconds before shouting, "Back to work." And just like that, the rhythm resumes. The machine breathes again, louder, as if offended by the interruption. You stare at your hands, then at the gears in front of you. For a fleeting moment, you swear the thing's alive, an iron animal with a taste for blood. It's not just accidents, though. The air itself feels poisonous. Lint hangs in thick clouds, sticking to your skin, your tongue, your lungs. Every breath rasps like sandpaper. Some workers tie handkerchiefs over their mouths, but the foreman calls it slacking off. You've heard rumors of a woman named Florence Nightingale who's trying to reform hospitals and push for sanitation, but factories aren't hospitals. Here, filth is just another raw material. Hours drag on. The lamps overhead flicker, the shadows stretch long, and your mind starts playing tricks. You imagine you can see the patterns in the noise rhythms that almost sound like speech. Sometimes it feels like the machines are whispering not words exactly, but intent. Keep going. Keep feeding me. When the bell for rest finally rings, you step away dizzy. The floor seems to sway like a ship deck. Tommy the boy with the bandaged hand leans against a wall, coughing hard enough to bend double. You pat his back, but the cough keeps coming. When he finally stops, his lips are pale and his eyes glassy. Just the dust, he wheezes. You nod. Everyone says that. The overseer walks by again, ledger in hand. He marks something down, probably the day's production count, maybe the number of injuries. You doubt he sees the difference. Numbers can't cough after all. Someone in the far corner starts humming a tune, something oddly cheerful like a pub song remembered from better days. Gradually, others pick it up. It spreads through the room like a shared secret, a rhythm under the rhythm. For a few brief minutes, it feels like rebellion. Soft, tuneless rebellion, but rebellion all the same. You hum along just loud enough to feel it in your chest. Then the whistle blares again and the sound dies instantly. The machines reclaim the air. The man nearest you mutters, "One day they'll whistle and no one will come back." You almost smile. One day, you echo, though neither of you believe it. The rest of the shift blurs. Your body aches from ankle to shoulder, fingers trembling from the constant motion. When at last the final whistle shrieks, you nearly forget to stop working. It takes a heartbeat to remember that you're allowed to stop at all. Outside, the rain has turned sleet. You pull your coat tighter and follow the crowd toward the gate. The overseer checks his watch again, satisfied that every minute has been extracted and accounted for. You pass him without a word, head low, steam rising from your collar. The street beyond the mill is a river of mud and lamplight. Workers spill out in silent waves, boots squelching breath, clouding in the cold. Nobody speaks. There's nothing to say. You wonder briefly how many will return tomorrow and how many won't. But the city doesn't notice. The machines never grieve. The first step outside the factory feels like surfacing from underwater. The air is wet, sharp, and alive again, though alive might be generous. You cough once, twice, clearing the soot from your throat, and the taste of iron lingers like a bad secret. All around, hundreds of workers spill into the streets like a gray tide. Boots slosh, cartwheels rattle, and somewhere a dog barks like it's announcing the end of the world. For a moment, you just stand there, blinking at the faint glow of the gas lamps through the fog. Then the thought hits you, absurdly simple but real. You survived another day. That alone feels almost heroic. Behind you, the factory looms a hulking red brick monster, its windows still glowing faintly, as if it's watching everyone leave. You half expect it to call you back, demand one more hour, one more drop of strength. It always does in its way. You start walking. The road home is long, maybe 2 miles through the maze of back streets. But everyone moves together, a slow river of exhaustion. Someone mutters a joke about how the fog's thicker than the soup at home, and the others snort. Even humor limps by this hour. The city at night is a strange creature, half asleep, half scheming. The gas lights flicker, catching on the wet cobblestones, and the reflections look like fireflies trapped in puddles. A street hawker calls out, selling roasted chestnuts from a tin pan that hisses and pops. The smell is heavenly. You almost reach for a penny before remembering pennies don't stretch that far anymore. You pass a group of factory women ahead of you, arm in arm, skirts splashed with mud. They're laughing loud enough to echo down the alley. Maybe it's the kind of laughter that keeps the dark at bay. One of them, red scarf bright against the gray, turns to you and grins. "You look half dead, love." "Only half, you say." She laughs again, and for a heartbeat the night feels warm. Then she's gone, swallowed by the fog. You keep walking past narrow shop fronts and shuttered taverns. In one window, a tailor's dummy stares out in a suit you'll never afford. In another, a poster promises work for honest men, apply within. I've learned not to take that kind of promise seriously. Honest men are cheap. Desperate ones are cheaper. The further you go, the quieter it gets. The crowd thins, the fog thickens, and soon it's just you, your footsteps, and then the steady drip of water from the eaves. You pass a church, its bell tower half hidden by smoke. Through the open door, you catch a glimpse of candlelight and hear a voice reading scripture. You pause, not from faith exactly, but from the warmth that spills out. Inside, a few souls sit, scattered in the pews. Old women, a dockhand with his cap in his lap, a child asleep on the floor. The vicar's voice is soft-tired. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden. You almost step inside just to sit a moment, but the thought of being still terrifies you more than the cold. So you move on. Your boots strike the cobble's steady rhythm, same as the machine's, but slower, gentler. Ahead, smoke drifts from a pub chimney, the dog and lantern. Warmth, laughter, light. It's tempting. Through the window, men huddle over their drinks, steam rising from their coats, faces flushed red from gin and cheap beer. For a moment, you imagine stepping inside, feeling the burn of warmth slide down your throat, forgetting the day entirely. Then, you remember the rent due tomorrow, and the image fades like a trick of the light. You keep walking. Somewhere behind you, a horse snorts. A carriage rattles past, wheels splashing mud over your boots. Inside, a gentleman leans back against the velvet seat, eyes half closed. Maybe he's heading home from the opera, maybe a dinner party. Either way, he doesn't see you, and if he did, he probably wouldn't recognize you as part of the same country. Still, you walk on. The tenements rise up again, tall, narrow, leaning on each other like tired men. Smoke curls from every chimney, blending with the fog until sky and city are the same color. You nod at a lamplighter climbing his ladder, his face orange in the glow. Evening, he says absently. You answer, what's left of it. By the time you reach your street, your legs feel carved from lead. The puddles reflect the lamps like dull gold coins, too beautiful for a place that smells this much of rot and coal. You pass the corner shop, closed now, and the woman who runs it waves from the upstairs window. Her husband died in the mill last winter, but she still smiles like the world hasn't beaten her completely. You nod back. It's all the kindness the night can afford. You turn into the narrow alley that leads home. The walls here are close, breathing damp, the ground uneven. A rat scurries past your boot. You don't even flinch anymore. Above, laundry lines sway in the breeze, shirts and trousers flapping like tired flags. One of them is yours, washed 2 days ago, still not dry. You reach your door at last. The hinges groan in protest as you push it open. Inside, the air is thick with warmth, steam, and the faint, hopeful smell of tea. Inside, it's dim and cramped, but it's home, or at least the version of home that exists when rent's paid, and the roof doesn't leak too much. You close the door against the drizzle and feel the air change instantly. Still heavy, but warmer, alive, with the sounds of domestic chaos. A kettle rattles faintly on the stove, and somewhere in the corner, your sister coughs in her sleep again. The sound is small, but sharp, like a reminder that the world outside follows you, even here. Your mother's at the table, rolling dough on a board the size of a book. The candlelight flickers across her face, carving deep shadows into lines that weren't there 10 years ago. You're late, she says without looking up. Her voice isn't angry, just tired in that bone-deep way that's older than words. The overseer held us longer, you reply, hanging your coat by the stove. Steam rises from it in lazy curls. someone lost an arm. She stops rolling for a moment, her hands frozen midair. Another one. You nod. There's no need to say more. In this city, bad news doesn't surprise anyone. It just changes names. Your father sits in the corner, boots off nursing a chipped mug of tea that smells faintly of something stronger. He worked the docks once before his back gave out. Now he takes odd jobs, hauling coal, mending carts. Anything that still pays in coins instead of promises. He lifts his eyes to you, offers a half smile, and says, "At least you came home with both arms, huh?" It's meant as a joke, but it lands somewhere between comfort and confession. You sit at the table and tear off a piece of bread. It's soft this time, still warm from the hearth. "We got a bit of dripping," your mother says quietly. Mrs. Barlow next door traded for sewing work. You dip your bread into it, savoring the small luxury. Greece never tasted so divine. Outside, you can hear the rain easing into a steady patter. The sound of a cart rolling over cobbles echoes faintly through the wall, followed by laughter from the next building over. Probably the Tanner family. They've got 6 children and still somehow manage to sound like a carnival every night. You don't know how they do it. Your sister stirs and opens her eyes, blinking in the low light. "Did you bring me anything?" She whispers, half a smile forming. You shake your head, then reach into your pocket and pull out a single boiled sweet, slightly fuzzy, from Lint. Her face lights up like Christmas morning. She pops it into her mouth and hums happily. That sound alone could make the whole day worth it. You lean back in your chair, staring at the ceiling. The cracks above form strange shapes, maps, rivers, even faces if you squint. You trace one with your eyes, a crack that stretches from corner to corner like a scar. It's been there for years, growing slow and steady, just like the rest of you. For a few minutes, there's peace. The kettle whistles softly. Your father hums something old, a sailor's tune from before he traded the sea for the city, and the world feels smaller, almost manageable. Then the floorboards creak upstairs. You hear footsteps, Mr. Vergreen, from the room above, the one who works nights at the brewery. He's dragging his boots again, probably half drunk. The sound goes back and forth, then stops with a thud. A moment later, a voice from another room yells, "Keep it down," followed by muffled laughter. It's not exactly quiet living, but you take comfort in the noise. Silence here feels dangerous, like something's gone missing. Your mother clears the table and pours what's left of the tea into chipped mugs. "Drink before it cools," she says, sliding one toward you. The warmth seeps into your fingers, and you let it linger there for a moment before taking a sip. It's weak and bitter, but somehow it's the best part of the day. Did you hear your father says suddenly they're talking about building a whole new line to the docks railway all the way to Liverpool? He says it with a kind of wonder, like the words themselves are proof that life might still surprise him. They say it'll bring more work. Or take it away, your mother mutters, wiping her hands. Machines do most of the lifting now. You glance between them, not sure who's right. Maybe both. The city changes faster than anyone can keep up. One year it's horse carts. The next it's railways and steamships. You wonder what comes after. Do people ever get replaced too? The conversation fades. Your sister hums herself back to sleep. Your father nods off in his chair and the candle burns low. You watch the flame dance, small and stubborn. It flickers, but never quite dies. You stretch your arms and stand the floor creaking underfoot. From the window, the city glows faintly, 100 chimneys exhaling into the night, each one a reminder that tomorrow will look exactly like today. You pull the curtain closed, let the room fade into darkness, and listen to the rain until it sounds almost like applause for having made it this far. The night doesn't end when you lie down, it just changes its shape. The straw mattress sighs beneath your weight, creaking in time with the wind outside. Your body feels like it's still at the factory, still jerking to the rhythm of machines that don't exist here. You close your eyes, but your fingers twitch in ghost movements, turning spindles, feeding thread. Even in dreams, work refuses to clock out. Your father's snoring fills the room deep and uneven, while your sister murmurs softly in her sleep. You roll onto your back and stare into the dark. Somewhere beyond the thin wall, the neighbors argue in slurred voices something about wages and gin. It's the same argument every night. Who spent what? Who promised what? Who promised what? You stop listening after a while. In a city like this, people shout just to remember they still have lungs. You reach for the small tin box under your bed. Inside are a few treasures, a scrap of newspaper with a drawing of the Great Exhibition, a button from your first coat, 2 farthings, and a folded page torn from a pamphlet you once found at the market. It's titled, Voices of Reform, the Working Man's Plea. You can't read every word. Your schooling ended too early, but you know what it means. Someone out there is talking about people like you. Someone's paying attention. You think of that sometimes when the work feels endless, how the world beyond your street might be changing. They say people are protesting in Manchester, that there's talk of labor rights and wages fit for a man. It sounds impossible, but so did railways once. You imagine standing in a crowd, listening to men in coats shout about freedom and fairness. Would it feel dangerous? Hopeful, maybe both. A gust rattles the window, and your daydream scatters. You chuckle softly. Hope doesn't come cheap here. You keep it tucked away like a secret coin. Spend it too often, and it loses value. Down the hall, someone starts singing low, slow, and sad. It's an old folk song, the kind people used to sing in the countryside before the smoke came. The melody curls through the building like mist. You recognize a few words about home fields and love that never ages. The irony isn't lost on you. Most people here won't live long enough to grow old, but they still sing as if they might. You close your eyes again, but sleep doesn't come easily. Your mind wanders to the girl with the blue sleeve, to Tommy coughing up dust, to the factory looming in the fog. Then it drifts further to the gentleman in polished shoes who call this progress, to the queen who reigns over it all, from a palace that probably smells of lavender, not smoke. You wonder if she dreams of the people who keep her empire spinning. When sleep finally starts to settle, it's interrupted by a noise from the street, laughter. Footsteps, the faint ring of a piano from the tavern down the block. You sit up and peer through the curtain. A group of men stumble along the alley, arms around each other, singing off-key. Dock workers, by the look of them. Their laughter rolls up to your window, loud and free, the sound of men who've traded exhaustion for drunken courage. For a moment you envy them. Gin might be poison, but it's the only medicine most can afford. You lie back down, staring at the ceiling again. The plaster glows faintly in the candle's dying light, and you trace shapes in it, faces, constellations, a better future. You picture a world where your sister doesn't cough herself awake, where your mother's hands don't crack from cold water, where you work because you choose to not, because the clock owns you. It sounds foolish, even as you imagine it, but you hold on to it anyway. Maybe someday you whisper into the dark. The words hang there, neither prayer nor promise, just sound. Sleep comes slowly, like a negotiation. You drift between memory and dream flashes of the mill. The clatter of spindles, the girl's blue sleeve, the overseer's watch ticking too loud. But then the dream shifts, softens. You're outside, standing in sunlight. Real sunlight. Warm, golden, almost liquid. The air smells of grass, not coal. You can hear birds instead of bells. It's too peaceful to be real. But you stay there anyway, letting the warmth sink into your bones. Maybe that's the real miracle of the human mind. It knows how to build paradise out of scraps, even if only for a few hours before dawn drags you back to the noise. The candle flickers one last time and dies. The room fades into darkness. Outside, the city murmurs in its sleep the hum of wheels, the hiss of rain, the sigh of chimneys cooling down for the night. Everything slows, waits. The morning doesn't come gently, it slams into you like the factory bell itself. You wake to the same gray light filtering through the thin curtain, the same creak of the floorboards as your father moves quietly by the door. For a moment you lie still, pretending not to hear the rain outside, pretending the world might have forgotten you overnight. But it hasn't. It never does. Your body protests every movement. Shoulders stiff, knees swollen, fingers locked from the cold. You flex them slowly, and they crack like old wood. The smell of smoke drifts in through the window. Someone's already stoking their morning fire. It should be comforting, but instead it just smells like another beginning of the same old story. You sit up, rubbing your eyes. The tin pan has caught another night's worth of drips from the ceiling. You empty it into the sink, watching the water swirl down, thinking absurdly that it's probably cleaner than the Thames. Your mother's already up, spooning porridge into bowls. She looks up briefly and says, "Eat before it clots." You do as you're told. It's thin, barely more than warm grain in gray water, but it fills the hollow. Across the table, your sister sneezes and laughs at herself, hair sticking out in every direction. You smile despite the fatigue. There's something stubbornly beautiful about how life keeps showing up here, ragged, coughing, half-starved, but alive. Then comes the whistle in the distance. You freeze for half a heartbeat. There it is, the sound that owns you. That long, shrill note slicing through the fog, reminding everyone who's in charge. And suddenly, something inside you stirs. Not rebellion exactly, but recognition. You think of the word you read once in that tattered pamphlet, dignity. The kind that doesn't need applause or title or pay raise. The kind that shows up anyway. Maybe that's what this is. Not surrender. Endurance. You stand, pull on your boots, and glance once more around the room. Your father gives you a nod from his chair, the kind of gesture that says, "I know without words." Your mother presses a piece of bread into your hand. Your sister waves, half asleep but smiling. These small things, they're what hold the whole fragile world together. Outside, the sky is bruised with dawn. The streets glisten, the puddles mirror the gaslights like tiny fragments of gold. Workers shuffle past with collars up, caps pulled low, each one carrying the weight of another day. But now you see them differently, not as shadows swallowed by fog, but as sparks, stubborn and countless. As you walk toward the mill, the wind carries the distant sound of church bells mingling with the factory horn. For a strange moment, the two harmonize, faith and labor, survival and sanctity, all stitched together in the same gray air. You breathe deep, cough, and keep moving. Past the corner shop, Mrs. Barlow waves again from her window, same as last night. You wave back. A boy chases after a cart, laughing, splashing through puddles. A lamplighter extinguishes the last flame, his ladder glistening with dew. Life keeps repeating itself, but maybe that repetition is what keeps it from breaking. You reach the factory gates just as the crowd begins to surge. The overseers, their pocket watch gleaming like always. You can already hear the gears turning inside that monstrous heartbeat, calling everyone home. For a second you hesitate. Not to run, not to rebel, just to look. The building's massive silhouette rises against the light chimney stacks, belching clouds that stretch into the dawn. It's ugly, yes, and cruel in its way. But it's also proof of something extraordinary, human persistence. The will to build, to move, to make meaning out of noise. Maybe it devours people, but somehow they keep coming back, turning grief into grit, monotony into survival. You step forward with the others. The gate clangs shut behind you. The hum begins again. And as the first machine roars to life, you catch your reflection faintly in a soot-dark window. Eyes ringed with fatigue, hands calloused and blackened, but still here. You almost smile. The city outside stirs, fully awake now. Chimneys belch, bells toll, streets fill with wheels and boots and shouts. Somewhere beyond the smog, sunlight tries to break through, weak, golden, persistent. It's the same fight every day, between shadow and light, between surrender and survival. You look up once more before the noise swallows you. The sky is the color of ash, but somewhere in it, a single pale beam finds its way down, landing on the wet cobblestones, like a blessing no one asked for, but everyone needs. And you whisper to yourself, barely audible under the thunder of machines, this isn't just work, it's life. Then the whistle blows again, and the day begins. And now, as the last whistle fades into the night, you can let the city's heartbeat slow. The mill's quiet, the smoke settles, and the rain outside becomes a lullaby against the window. You've walked through the noise, the hunger, the small hopes that kept a whole world turning. So breathe softly, slowly, as the lamps dim and the past drifts into dream. Somewhere beyond the fog, a new day waits, but not yet. For now rest, traveler of time. Let the echoes of Victorian streets fade to silence, and sleep knowing you've survived their endless rhythm.